The call that changed everything. The night was quiet in Los Angeles. Rain tapped gently against the tall glass windows of Keanu Reeves's home. The city lights below looked blurred through the mist, like a painting slowly melting away. Keanu sat alone in his living room, a single lamp glowing beside him. His phone rested on the table, screen dark, but his mind restless. He hadn't slept properly for days. Something heavy was pressing on his heart, something he couldn't ignore anymore. He had always been known for his calmness, his silence, and his quiet strength. But tonight felt different. His hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of water. The sound of the rain mixed with the beating of his heart. He tried to focus, but memories kept flooding in. Memories of faces, laughter, and moments he thought he had buried long ago. One of those memories was of Sandra Bullock. It had been years since they last spoke. Life had taken them in different directions, and both had chosen silence over conversation. But there was always a strange bond between them, something that never faded, no matter how much time passed. He had thought about calling her many times, but pride, fear, and guilt had stopped him. Until now. Keanu looked at his phone again. His reflection stared back at him, tired eyes, unshaved face, and a sadness he couldn't hide. He scrolled through his contacts until he saw her name. His fingers hovered above it for a moment. The rain outside grew heavier, and thunder rolled in the distance. It felt like the universe was holding its breath, waiting for his decision. He pressed the call button. The dial tone echoed in his ear, each beep slower than the last. He almost hung up halfway, but then her voice came through. Soft, warm, slightly surprised. "Keanu?" she said. He closed his eyes for a second, trying to steady his breath. "Hey, it's me." "I know it's you," she replied gently. "Are you okay?" There was a pause. He wanted to say yes, but the word wouldn't come out. Instead, he whispered, "I need your help." Her tone changed immediately. "Where are you?" He told her his address, though she already knew it. She didn't ask questions. She just said, "I'm coming." When the call ended, he put the phone down and leaned back on the couch. The silence in the house felt heavier now. He stared at the door, waiting for something he didn't even understand. 15 minutes passed. The rain grew louder. A car pulled up outside. Through the window, he saw her step out, umbrella in one hand, coat pulled tight. Even in the dim light, she looked strong, composed. The same Sandra he remembered from years ago. The woman who could light up a room with just a glance. She walked up the steps, her shoes splashing in puddles. Keanu stood frozen. He wanted to move, to open the door before she could knock, but his body wouldn't listen. His mind was racing through memories. The first time they met on set. The laughs they shared. The pain they hid behind their smiles. All of it came rushing back. A soft knock broke his thoughts. Then another. "Keanu?" Her voice called from the other side. "It's me." He took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the door. His footsteps echoed through the empty house. Each one felt heavier than the last. He reached for the handle, hesitated for a heartbeat, and then turned it. The door opened, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The sight of him made Sandra's heart twist. His eyes were red, his face pale, and his shoulders carried a weight she couldn't name. Rain dripped from his hair, and he looked like a man who had been standing in a storm for too long, inside and out. "What happened?" she asked softly, stepping inside. He didn't answer. His lips trembled as he tried to find words. She placed her umbrella by the door, watching him closely. And then, without warning, his eyes filled with tears. He turned away, covering his face with one hand, and whispered something she barely heard. "It's happening again," he said. "What's happening again?" she asked, walking closer. He shook his head. "The dreams, the memories, the feeling that I've lost something important." She placed her hand gently on his arm. "You haven't lost everything, Keanu. You still have people who care." He turned to her, eyes glistening. "Then why does it feel like I'm alone?" The question hung in the air, raw and unguarded. She didn't answer. Instead, she did something she hadn't done in years. She hugged him. No words, no explanations, just warmth. And for a few seconds, Keanu allowed himself to break. His shoulders shook as he held on to her, the tears finally spilling free. Outside, the storm began to calm, as if the world was exhaling with him. When they finally sat down, she looked around his house. Photos, books, half-finished sketches, and a piano covered with dust. "You haven't been playing," she said softly. He nodded. "I can't." "Why?" He stared at the keys across the room. "Because it reminds me of her." Sandra looked confused. "Who?" He hesitated, his eyes distant. "Someone I should have never let go." For a moment, she thought he was talking about a lost love. But then she noticed something, a small photo frame on the shelf. It showed Keanu and a woman with dark hair, smiling beside an old upright piano. The picture was faded, but the emotion in it was alive. "She used to play," he whispered. "And every time I touch those keys, I hear her voice again." Sandra's chest tightened. She had seen him strong through so many things, but never like this, never broken. She realized this wasn't about fame or loneliness or old wounds. This was something deeper, something personal. She reached out, touching his hand gently. "Then maybe it's time you play again. Not for her, not for anyone else, just for yourself." He looked at her, eyes soft but unsure. "I don't think I can." "You can," she said firmly. "You just need someone to sit beside you." He didn't respond, but a faint smile tried to appear. They sat in silence, listening to the rain, the weight between them shifting slowly from pain to comfort. It was strange how easy it was to fall back into connection with someone who had once known your soul. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then went out. The house fell into darkness, except for the dim streetlight outside shining through the wet glass. The thunder rolled again, closer this time. "Power's out," Sandra murmured. Keanu stood up, grabbing a flashlight from the table. "It's fine. Happens during storms." He walked toward the hallway, but as the beams swept across the walls, he froze. Something was there, something written on the mirror near the staircase. Words drawn with what looked like condensation, or maybe something else. Sandra noticed his sudden stillness. "What is it?" He didn't answer at first. He stepped closer, the light trembling slightly in his hand. Then he whispered the words out loud. "Don't forget me." The letters dripped slowly, like tears down glass. And just like that, the air in the room turned colder. Sandra moved closer, staring at the mirror. "Keanu, who wrote that?" He shook his head slowly. "No one's been here all day." A chill ran down her spine. The silence in the house deepened, and for the first time, even the rain seemed to pause. She looked at him, voice quiet but firm. "Keanu, what's really going on here?" He turned to her, eyes filled with something she couldn't read. Fear, sorrow, and something else. "That's what I'm afraid to tell you," he said. The flashlight flickered again, and then, somewhere deep inside the house, a piano key played on its own. One single note, long, soft, haunting. The sound of the piano. The single piano note hung in the air, fading slowly into the silence. Sandra froze where she stood, her eyes darting toward the living room. Keanu's hand tightened around the flashlight, his breathing quick and uneven. He knew that sound. He had heard it before, in his dreams, in the late hours when he woke drenched in sweat, and sometimes when he swore he was alone, Sandra whispered. "Was that the piano?" Keanu said softly, finishing her thought. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain outside tapped softly again, almost like the rhythm of that one note. Keanu slowly walked toward the room, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grasp. Sandra followed behind him, keeping close, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. When they reached the piano, it stood exactly where it had always been, near the window overlooking the city. The cover was still down. The dust on the keys looked untouched, yet the air around it felt charged, like electricity before lightning. Sandra looked at Keanu. "Maybe it's the wind," she offered gently. He shook his head. "There's no wind inside a locked house." He knelt slowly, touching the wood of the piano, and then opened the cover. The keys gleamed faintly in the beam of light, each one silent now. He reached out and pressed a single note. It echoed softly, warm and full. "Normal. See?" she said, trying to steady the tension in her voice. But Keanu's gaze wasn't on the keys. It was on something sitting just above them, a small piece of paper folded neatly. He reached for it, hands shaking. The paper was damp around the edges, like it had absorbed the air itself. When he unfolded it, a faint scent rose. Something floral, something familiar. Written in delicate handwriting were 3 words. "Play it again." Sandra frowned. Who would leave that? Keanu stared at the note, his mind racing through possibilities. No one had been in the house. The doors were locked, security cameras outside still blinking red. He hadn't told anyone to visit. That's what she used to say, he murmured. Sandra tilted her head. The woman in the photo? He nodded slowly. Every night before she played, she'd smile at me and say, "Won't play it again." It was her way of keeping moments alive. And now someone wrote it. Someone or something, he said quietly. The silence deepened again, and Sandra could feel the goosebumps rise along her arms. She wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but there was something in the air, something beyond logic. Still, she tried to keep him grounded. Maybe you wrote it and forgot. You haven't been sleeping, right? He shook his head. No, I remember everything I do in this house. I don't forget things like that. He set the note down gently and walked to the window. The city lights shimmered below, distant and unaware. Sometimes I think this place remembers more than I do, he whispered. Sandra joined him. What do you mean? She lived here too, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Before she got sick. We used to spend every night by that piano. When she passed, I couldn't stay here for months. But when I finally came back, the first night, that piano played by itself. Sandra's lips parted. Keanu! I thought it was my mind, he continued. Grief can make you hear things, see things. I told myself that. But it happened again. And again. And tonight, he turned toward her slowly. Tonight, it feels like she's trying to say something. Sandra didn't know what to reply. She looked around the dimly lit room, the framed photos, the shadows moving with every flash of lightning, the air thick with emotion. This was more than just sadness. It was a connection between love and memory, between what's gone and what refuses to leave. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, a faint creak sounded. Both turned their heads sharply. Upstairs, Keanu whispered. Sandra's pulse quickened. Do you have anyone here? Staff, maybe? No, just me. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate footsteps across the hallway above. Sandra looked at him, her eyes wide. Please tell me you have a logical explanation. He didn't. He only grabbed another flashlight from the drawer, handed it to her, and started up the stairs. She followed close, her hand gripping the banister, her other hand trembling slightly with the beam of light. The hallway was long, lined with portraits and shelves of old books. A cold draft swept through, though every window was shut tight. They reached the last door at the end, the guest room. Keanu pushed it open. The room was dark, untouched for years. But in the center of the bed lay something unexpected, a small velvet box. That wasn't here before, Keanu said softly. He approached it slowly. Sandra stayed by the door, watching. He opened the box. Inside was a single silver key, aged and slightly tarnished, tied with a thin red ribbon. Beneath it on the velvet lining was a small folded card. He opened it. This time the handwriting was bolder, more deliberate. You forgot the promise. Sandra felt a chill crawl down her spine. What promise? Keanu's throat tightened. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I wouldn't close myself off. That I'd keep living, keep loving, keep creating. He looked down at the key. But I didn't. I stopped everything. I shut the world out. Sandra stepped closer, her voice soft. And now someone wants to remind you of that promise. He nodded slowly, eyes still locked on the key. But why now? After all these years? Maybe you were ready to hear it now, she said gently. He took the key and held it tightly in his hand. It was cold, heavier than it looked. This key? It doesn't belong to any door in this house. Then what does it open? He looked at her, eyes narrowing with realization. Her old music box. The one I locked away. Where is it? He hesitated, then whispered, in the basement. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting their shadows long against the wall. Sandra sighed, forcing a small smile. Of course it's in the basement. Because where else would a haunting memory be? Keanu almost laughed, a soft, tired sound. You don't have to come with me. I'm not leaving you alone with this, she said firmly. If you're going down there, I'm coming too. Together, they made their way down the stairs again, the air growing colder with each step. When they reached the basement door, Keanu hesitated. It creaked as he turned the handle. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air. The basement was dark, lined with boxes, old furniture, and covered paintings. Cobwebs clung to the corners. Keanu's flashlight swept across the room until it landed on a small chest near the wall. That's it, he whispered. He walked toward it, the silver key still in his hand. Sandra stood a few feet behind, watching every movement. When he knelt down, the key slid perfectly into the lock. He turned it slowly, a soft click. Inside lay a small, beautifully carved music box, its edges worn by time. The wood was smooth, with a faded engraving on the lid. He lifted it gently and set it on the table. This was hers, he said. She used to play it every night before bed. And you locked it away after she passed. He nodded. I couldn't bear to hear the tune anymore. He opened the lid. The box's gears whirred softly to life. A delicate melody filled the basement. Slow, haunting, but strangely beautiful. Sandra closed her eyes for a moment, listening. That's lovely, Keanu didn't reply. He was staring at the tiny mirror inside the lid. As the tune played, fog slowly began to form across the glass. Sandra noticed it too. Is that... And then words appeared, written in the fog like before. Find the letter. Keanu's heart stopped. He leaned closer, voice barely above a whisper. What letter? But the fog faded, the words vanishing with it. The melody slowed and stopped. Silence filled the air again, heavier than before. Sandra exhaled slowly. This just keeps getting more and more real. Keanu turned off the flashlight, the room falling into partial darkness. There was a letter she wrote before she died, he said softly. She said she'd leave it for me. I searched everywhere, but I never found it. Sandra looked at him, eyes wide. Then maybe this is her way of helping you find it. But where? If she wanted you to find it now, maybe it's somewhere you've been avoiding, she said. He looked around the basement, the old piano bench, the dusty trunks, the shelves. Then his gaze stopped at one corner, hidden behind a heavy drape. He walked toward it and pulled the fabric aside. There stood an old wooden door, small and cracked, one he hadn't opened in years. He looked back at Sandra. This used to be her writing room. Then that's where we start, she said. He nodded slowly, reaching for the handle. But before he could open it, a voice, soft, almost familiar, whispered from the darkness. Don't go in alone, Sandra gasped. Keanu froze. The flashlight flickered violently, and the air turned ice cold. The whisper in the dark, the basement was silent again, but not peaceful. The whisper still echoed in their minds, soft, chilling, unmistakably human. Sandra's pulse raced, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. Keanu stood frozen, staring at the old wooden door. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Sandra whispered, Did you hear that too? Keanu nodded slowly. Yes. Then I'm not imagining it, he exhaled, trying to steady his breath. No, but that voice, he paused. It sounded like hers. Sandra felt the hair on her arms rise. Keanu, maybe this isn't something we should, but he was already stepping closer to the door. If there's something she's trying to tell me, I need to know. Sandra reached out and grabbed his arm. You're not going in there alone. He looked at her, eyes filled with gratitude and fear all at once. Thank you. Together they faced the door. The handle was old and cold, its metal rough under Keanu's fingers. He turned it slowly. It creaked open with a low groan, releasing a faint scent of paper, dust, and something faintly floral, the same scent from the note upstairs. The beam of the flashlight revealed a small room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old journals, photographs, and sketches. A desk sat by the window, covered in notebooks and sealed envelopes. Everything looked untouched for years, frozen in time. Keanu stepped inside first. The floor creaked softly beneath his feet. He ran his hand over the desk, brushing away dust. His eyes moved across the scattered pages, each filled with neat handwriting. Sandra followed, her gaze falling on the photos pinned to the wall. Most were of Keanu and the same woman, the one from the picture by the piano. They were laughing, dancing, living, moments of light trapped in fading color. She wrote a lot, Sandra said quietly. Yeah, Keanu replied. She used to say that writing kept her from disappearing. He opened one of the notebooks. The pages were filled with reflections, quotes, and little reminders like keep breathing, remember to smile, forgive yourself. Sandra watched him carefully. Every word seemed to pull him deeper into memories he wasn't ready to face. Then something caught her eye, a small wooden box beneath the desk, covered by an old scarf. Keanu, what's that? He looked down and knelt, pulling the box into the light. It was locked with a small latch, no keyhole in sight. It's hers, he said softly. She kept her unfinished letters in here. But how do we open it? Before he could answer, the silver key in his pocket grew warm, so warm that he could feel it through the fabric. He pulled it out, stunned. The metal shimmered faintly in the dim light. Sandra's eyes widened. Is that the key from the box upstairs? He whispered. Without thinking, he pressed the key against the latch. There was no visible hole, but the metal seemed to melt into the lock. A faint click followed, and the lid slowly lifted on its own. Inside were several letters tied with ribbon. The top one had his name written in her familiar handwriting. Keanu. His breath caught. He reached out slowly, hands trembling. Sandra placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do this now, she whispered. I think I do, he replied softly. He untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The paper was fragile, but the ink was clear. His eyes moved across the words, and his lips parted slightly as he began to read aloud. My dearest Keanu, if you're reading this, it means time has passed, and maybe I'm no longer there to tell you the things I couldn't say. I know you carry silence like armor, but please don't let it become your prison. I'm not gone, my love. I live in the things you create, in the kindness you show, in the quiet moments when you think of me. If the piano still plays, let it. If the rain still falls, let it remind you that grief is just love with nowhere to go. His voice broke at the last line. Sandra stood quietly, eyes glistening. She could feel the emotion in every word, the way it reached beyond death to hold onto something real. He continued reading, softer now. You once promised me that no matter what happened, you'd never stop believing in beauty. Don't break that promise, Keanu. The world needs your light, and if you ever feel lost, follow the melody. It will always lead you home. The letter ended there. Keanu stared at the paper, his hands shaking slightly. He folded it carefully, holding it to his chest. Sandra exhaled deeply. She must have loved you so much. She did, he said quietly, and I think she still does. Then he looked back into the box. There were other letters, but one stood out, its envelope darker, sealed with red wax. No name on it, just a single symbol etched into the corner, a small piano key. What's that one? Sandra asked. He picked it up, turning it over. I've never seen this before. He tried to open it, but the wax wouldn't break. It felt like stone beneath his fingers. Maybe it's not meant for you, Sandra suggested gently. He frowned. Then who else could it be for? As if answering her, the piano upstairs played again, 3 notes this time. Slow, deliberate, they both froze. Keanu whispered, that melody? You know it. He nodded. It's the one she wrote before she died. She said it was unfinished. She called it her goodbye. Sandra's voice trembled. Keanu, are you sure this isn't your mind creating patterns? No, he said firmly. That melody, it was never recorded. No one else could know it. Another note echoed from above, softer this time, like an invitation. Keanu stood, holding the sealed letter tightly. She wants me to play. You mean go back upstairs? He nodded. Yes. Maybe that's how I'll understand what she's trying to say. They climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. The house felt alive now, the air humming faintly, the lights flickering as though reacting to every emotion in the room. When they reached the piano, it stood open, waiting. The note with the words "play it again" still rested on the stand. Keanu sat down. Sandra stayed beside him. He placed his hands on the keys, hesitating for a moment. She always said music was a conversation with the soul, he whispered. Maybe it still is. He pressed the first key, and the room seemed to breathe. The melody unfolded gently, familiar yet different. Sandra closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. The tune was full of longing, memory, and something deeper, a message trying to reach across time. As Keanu played, something strange happened. The sealed letter on the piano began to vibrate softly. Sandra gasped as it lifted slightly, hovering for a second before landing again. The wax seal cracked cleanly down the middle. Keanu stopped playing. The house fell silent once more. He picked up the letter and opened it. Inside was a small piece of paper with only one line written in a hurried hand. Find the unfinished song. Sandra blinked. Another clue, Keanu looked thoughtful. She used to keep her drafts somewhere. Her unfinished songs, her notes. He turned to Sandra slowly. In the studio. The one you closed off after she passed? He nodded. No one's been in there since. Then that's where we need to go next, she said firmly. He hesitated. I'm afraid of what I'll find. She smiled faintly. Maybe you'll find what you've been missing. They walked toward the back hallway that led to the small recording studio. The air grew heavier with each step, the sound of the storm fading behind them. When they reached the door, Keanu paused again, resting his hand on the handle. He turned to Sandra. No matter what happens, thank you for being here. She squeezed his hand. You don't have to thank me, you just have to open the door. He nodded and pushed it open. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of an old lamp. Music sheets were scattered everywhere, instruments covered with cloths. In the corner, a reel recorder sat silent, its tape frozen mid-turn. Keanu walked in slowly. This is where she recorded her last song, he whispered. But she never finished it. Sandra looked around. Maybe that's what she wants you to do. He turned to her, eyes glistening. Finish it? Yes, she said softly, so she can finally rest. And so can you? He moved toward the piano in the studio, identical to the one upstairs but older, marked with scratches and memories. He lifted the lid and stared at the keys for a long moment. Then he began to play. The same melody from before, but as he reached the final few notes, something unexpected happened. The reel recorder turned on by itself, its reels spinning slowly. Sandra gasped. Keanu, he looked at it, astonished. It's recording. A faint female voice came through the static, soft, emotional, trembling. If anyone hears this, it means I couldn't finish it, but maybe he will. Keanu's eyes filled with tears. He whispered her name. The voice continued, when the song is complete, follow the light. The reel clicked off. Silence returned. Sandra whispered, what does she mean, follow the light? Keanu turned toward the window. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating something on the wall. An outline of a heart drawn faintly in dust, glowing for just a moment before fading again. And inside that heart was a single word written in faint white chalk. Forgive. Keanu stared at it, frozen. Sandra placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Maybe that's what this is all about. He turned slowly, eyes wet. I think she's telling me to forgive myself. The room grew quiet again. Only the soft hum of the old lamp filled the silence. But just as he started to breathe again, the piano played a final note by itself, and the lights in the room went out completely. The room of forgiveness, the darkness, was complete. For a long moment, neither Keanu nor Sandra moved. The silence pressed against their ears, heavy and deep. The only sound was the faint tick of the old reel recorder slowing to a stop. Then somewhere in the distance, a soft light began to flicker, pale, golden, and pulsing like a heartbeat. It came from the hallway outside the studio. Sandra whispered, that must be the light she meant. Keanu turned his head toward it. Follow the light, he murmured, remembering the words from the recording. They moved carefully through the dark, guided only by that soft glow. Every step echoed on the wooden floor. The light seemed to move, leading them through the hallway like it wanted them to follow. As they walked, Sandra noticed the air changing. It felt warmer now, softer, almost peaceful. The storm outside had quieted, replaced by a gentle drizzle. The light stopped in front of a door at the far end of the corridor. Keanu recognized it immediately. That's her art room, he said softly. She used to paint in there. He reached for the handle, but it wouldn't turn. Sandra handed him the silver key again. It was glowing faintly in his palm. He placed it in the lock. A click. The door creaked open. The room inside was bathed in soft light, even though no lamps were lit. Canvases lined the walls, each one covered with layers of dust. Brushes were still in their jars, and half-used paint tubes lay scattered across a wooden table. On the center easel stood a single canvas, draped with a white cloth. Keanu froze. He hadn't seen that cloth since the night she passed away. She had told him not to remove it until he was ready. This was the last thing she painted, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe she wants you to see it now, Sandra replied gently. He hesitated, then stepped closer. His hand shook as he lifted the cloth. Beneath it was a painting of the two of them, Keanu and her, sitting by the piano. But what caught his breath was the background. Behind their figures was a glowing doorway filled with light, and in the center of it, faint words were painted in gold. Forgive yourself. Keanu stared at it for a long time, his eyes filled with tears. She painted this after she knew she was dying, he said softly. She said art was her way of saying goodbye. Sandra touched the edge of the canvas. She left this for you to find when you were ready. And now you are. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on another detail he hadn't noticed before. On the far wall, a small mirror hung crooked. Carved into its frame were tiny letters, the same handwriting from the notes. "The truth lives behind reflection." Keanu walked to the mirror. "Behind reflection," he repeated. He ran his fingers along the edges until he felt a loose panel at the back. He pulled gently and a small envelope slid out, old and yellowed. His name was written on it once again. Sandra stood beside him. "This must be the letter she wanted you to find." His hands trembled as he opened it. The paper inside was thin, the ink faded but still legible. "My love, if you found this, it means you followed the signs. I never wanted my death to become your prison. I wanted my absence to teach you how to live again. You have carried guilt for things beyond your control. You couldn't save me, but you saved me in other ways, with your kindness, with your heart. Now please let me go, let the light in. Let love find you again." His breath caught. Every word broke something open inside him. "When you forgive yourself, you'll hear me one last time, not in sadness, but in peace." The letter ended there. Keanu lowered it slowly, his tears falling silently onto the paper. Sandra placed a hand over his. "She wanted you to heal." He nodded, unable to speak. The room felt different now, brighter, calmer, almost sacred. They stood in silence for a while, the painting glowing faintly in the golden light. And then, just as the stillness settled, the piano in the other room began to play again. This time, it wasn't just a few notes. It was the full melody, the unfinished song. Complete, beautiful, filled with both sorrow and hope. Keanu's eyes widened. "She finished it." Sandra shook her head softly. "No, you did, by forgiving yourself." They walked back toward the studio, following the sound. The melody filled the house, echoing through every hallway. When they entered the room, the piano was playing itself, the keys moving gently as if guided by invisible hands. Keanu stepped closer, tears still glistening in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered into the air. And then, as if hearing him, the music slowed and faded, the final note stretching into silence. The air shimmered for a moment, and then something impossible happened. A faint figure appeared near the piano, soft, translucent, glowing faintly like moonlight through glass. Her face was peaceful, her eyes kind. Sandra gasped quietly, her hand covering her mouth. Keanu froze, his heart racing. "Is it?" "Yes," Sandra whispered. "It's her." The figure smiled, warm and gentle, and for a moment the entire room felt lighter. Keanu stepped forward, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything, for holding on too long, for not living the way you wanted me to." The figure tilted her head slightly, her lips moving though no sound came. Then slowly she raised her hand and placed it over her heart. Keanu understood. "You've forgiven me," he said softly. The figure nodded once, and as the golden light around her began to brighten, she pointed toward Sandra, then toward Keanu's chest. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "She wants you to live again," she whispered. The light grew stronger, filling the entire studio. Keanu squinted through it, his heart aching and healing at the same time. And then, just like that, the figure dissolved into the light, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and a sense of peace that wrapped the room like a blanket. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again, not haunted but full of warmth. Sandra wiped her tears and smiled softly. "She's gone now." Keanu nodded slowly. "No," he said, his voice calm. "She's free now." They sat together by the piano, the rain outside finally stopping. The silence was different now, not heavy but peaceful. Sandra looked at him. "What will you do now?" Keanu thought for a long moment. "Live the way she wanted me to, open the doors again, make music again," she smiled. "That sounds like her kind of ending," he smiled faintly. "No, it's just the beginning." But just as he said that, something unexpected caught his eye. On the piano keys, a small golden locket rested, a locket he had never seen before. He picked it up and opened it. Inside was a tiny picture of her, and beneath the photo, a folded piece of paper too small to read without opening. He carefully unfolded it, one final message. "Look under the tree where we first met." He looked up slowly, stunned. "The tree," Sandra frowned. "What tree?" "There's an old oak tree near the lake house," he said. "We met there during our first movie shoot. We used to go there every year." Sandra nodded. "Then that's where we go next." Keanu took a deep breath. "I don't know if I can handle more of this." "You can," she said, taking his hand. "Because this isn't about pain anymore. It's about closure." The golden locket glimmered softly in his palm, as if guiding them toward one final truth waiting to be uncovered. And as they stood up to leave, the piano played one last note, soft, gentle, and full of promise. The secret beneath the oak tree the morning arrived quietly. A soft mist hung over Los Angeles, turning the streets into silver lines beneath the pale sun. Keanu stood by his car, the golden locket hanging around his neck. The words from the note inside echoed in his mind again and again. Look under the tree where we first met. Sandra stepped outside, carrying 2 travel mugs of coffee. Ready? Keanu nodded. As ready as I can be. They got into the car. The drive to the lake house was long, winding through hills and forest roads that seemed to carry whispers of the past. Keanu kept his eyes on the road, silent for most of the journey. Sandra watched him, understanding that his silence wasn't distance, it was reflection. After 2 hours, the city faded behind them. Tall pines lined both sides of the road, and the lake appeared in the distance, still and silver beneath a blanket of fog. The old cabin by the water looked exactly as it had years ago, its wooden frame weathered but standing strong. Keanu parked the car and stepped out. The air smelled of pine, rain, and memory. He walked slowly toward the clearing where the oak tree stood, a giant, ancient presence with branches that reached toward the clouds. "We shot our first scene here," he said softly. "The one where we were supposed to say goodbye, but neither of us could stop laughing." Sandra smiled faintly. She must have loved this place. "She did," he said. "She called it her safe world." They stood under the tree for a moment, looking up at the branches swaying gently in the breeze. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering golden patches on the grass. Keanu knelt down and began brushing away the fallen leaves at the base of the trunk. After a moment, he paused. Something solid touched his hand. "What is it?" Sandra asked. He dug a little deeper, his fingers scraping against metal. Soon he pulled out a small tin box, rusted, covered in dirt, but still intact. "This must be it," he whispered. They sat down together under the tree. Keanu opened the lid slowly. Inside, wrapped in an old scarf, was a bundle of letters, a small cassette tape, and a folded sheet of paper. The first letter was addressed to him again, in her handwriting. He opened it carefully and began to read aloud. "My dear Keanu, if you found this, it means you followed the path I left for you. I wanted to make sure that, when you were ready, you'd find every piece of me, not to haunt you, but to remind you that love never disappears. You once said that every goodbye is just the beginning of another story. Maybe this is ours." His voice trembled as he continued. "I left a recording here. It's not a song. It's something I wanted you to hear when you were strong enough. Play it when you're ready, and remember, don't listen with your ears. Listen with your heart." Keanu placed the letter down gently, his eyes wet. Sandra reached into the box and took out the small cassette tape. It was labeled simply, for Keanu. "Do you still have something to play this with?" she asked. He nodded. "There's an old player inside the cabin." They walked toward the lake house together. The wooden porch creaked under their feet. When Keanu opened the door, the familiar scent of cedar and rain-soaked wood greeted them. Everything inside looked untouched, like time had paused here. The old cassette player sat on a shelf by the window. Keanu picked it up, brushed off the dust, and placed the tape inside. He pressed play. A moment of static filled the air, then a soft voice began to speak. "Hi, love. If you're hearing this, then you've done something brave. You came back." The sound of her voice hit him like a wave. Soft, warm, full of the same gentle rhythm he remembered. "I don't want you to remember me as the girl who got sick, or the one who left too soon. I want you to remember the laughter, the rain, the late nights by the piano. I want you to remember the good, because that's what stays." Keanu's shoulders began to shake. Sandra stood quietly nearby, tears running down her cheeks as the recording continued. "You once told me that pain is love's shadow. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's why it hurts so much, because what we had was real. But promise me something, Keanu. Promise me you'll let life surprise you again. Don't hide from the world. Don't close your heart. Let someone in the way you once let me in." Her voice cracked slightly in the recording, but she went on. "And when you finally forgive yourself, look up at the stars. I'll be there listening to the music you make." The tape clicked and stopped. Silence filled the room. Keanu covered his face with his hands, breathing deeply. Sandra knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "She loved you more than words can say. She was my light," he whispered. "And I let that light go out." "No," Sandra said softly. "You didn't. You carried it with you all this time. You just didn't know." He looked at her, eyes red but calm. "Maybe you're right." They sat quietly for a few minutes. Outside, the sky cleared completely. Sunlight streamed through the window, golden and warm. The world felt lighter, as if the weight that had followed him for years was finally lifting. Then Sandra noticed something else in the box, a folded piece of sheet music. "Look," she said, handing it to him. He unfolded it carefully. At the top of the page, written in her handwriting, were the words, "The Last Note." The melody was simple, unfinished, only a few lines of music with a single blank space at the end. "She wanted you to finish this," Sandra said softly. Keanu looked at it, then at the piano in the corner of the cabin. "Maybe that's what she meant when she said to let the melody lead me home." He walked toward the piano, his fingers brushing the keys. He placed the sheet music in front of him and began to play. The first notes were gentle and slow, filling the room like a prayer. Sandra stood near the window, watching as the sound blended with the whisper of wind outside. The unfinished melody began to take shape, guided by something deeper than memory, something pure. And then, as he played the final chord, the blank space seemed to fill itself. The sound grew brighter, fuller, and the locket around his neck began to glow faintly. A breeze swept through the room, carrying the faint scent of her perfume. Keanu looked up through tears, smiling softly. "Thank you," he whispered. The piano echoed one last note on its own, soft as a sigh. Outside, sunlight broke fully through the clouds. The lake sparkled like glass. Sandra turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think she's at peace now." Keanu nodded slowly. "And so am I," but just as the moment settled, something shifted. Sandra's gaze fell to the piano bench, where a small folded paper had appeared as if out of nowhere. "Keanu, look!" He reached for it, opening it slowly. Inside, in her familiar handwriting, were just 4 words. "This isn't the end." He stared at it, his heart racing. "What does that mean?" Sandra looked at him, her expression a mix of confusion and wonder. Maybe there's still more she wants you to know." He turned the note over. On the back, faintly written in pencil, was a date and a location. December 12. "Venice." Keanu looked up slowly, stunned. "Venice," Sandra repeated. "As in Italy." He nodded. "It's where we were supposed to go together. She always said if she couldn't finish her life here, she'd finish it there." Sandra smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's where your story really ends." He held the note tightly, feeling a strange calmness in his chest. The lake shimmered behind him, the wind gentle and warm. He knew what he had to do next.